The C-47 bucked hard against the wind, a tin can in a torrent. Inside, Alara Vance sat perfectly still, a small, gray-haired woman lost in the folds of a borrowed parka. Her hands, wrinkled and showing the faint tracery of old scars, rested on her knees. She watched the other passengers, a squad of young rangers, all lean muscle and hardened confidence. They shouted jokes over the rotor wash, their laughter sharp and brittle in the thin, freezing air. One of them, a sergeant with a jawline like a hatchet, caught her eye. He grinned, a flash of white teeth in a grime-streaked face. "First time this high up, ma'am?" he yelled, his voice laced with the easy condescension of youth. "Don't worry, the landing is the fun part." His name was Reyes, according to the tape on his helmet. Alara offered a small, non-committal nod. Her gaze drifted past him to the reinforced window, to the jagged, snow-dusted peaks clawing at the bruised purple sky. The Hindu Kush, a place that chewed up equipment and men with equal indifference. She knew its moods. She had mapped its treachery on paper and in blood decades before Sergeant Reyes had learned to tie his boots. The helicopter descended with a stomach-lurching drop, flaring out over a plateau carved into a mountain's flank. FOB Nightingale, a cluster of sand-colored tents and hardened containers, ringed by HESCO barriers and razor wire. It looked like a scab on the face of the planet. As the ramp lowered, a blast of wind, thick with ice crystals, tore through the cabin. The Rangers shuffled out, their movements economical and practiced. Alara followed, her steps measured, favoring her left leg slightly. The limp was old, a quiet companion from another life. On the ground, the cold was a physical blow. It stole the breath and burned the lungs. A corporal, Davies, younger than Reyes but cut from the same cloth, jogged over to grab a crate. He glanced at Alara, then at her simple canvas duffel. "You the logistics auditor? From CENTCOM?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. "Colonel Thorne's expecting you. Command tent's the big one. Try not to get blown away." He smirked at Reyes, who snorted in amusement. They saw a civilian, a bureaucrat. Worse, an old woman, frail and out of place in their world of primal, masculine force. Alara adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. Her eyes weren't on the smirking soldiers. They were sweeping the perimeter. She noted the placement of the 50 calories machine gun nests, the interlocking fields of fire. She saw the blind spot near the western ridge, where the shadow of a neighboring peak would provide cover for a midday approach. She saw the way the fuel bladders were stored too close to the primary ammo dump, a rookie mistake born of convenience over tactical sense. She cataloged it all with a detached, silent efficiency that went utterly unnoticed. The soldiers saw a lost-looking grandmother. She saw a dozen ways for them all to die. She walked toward the command tent, the crunch of her boots on the frozen gravel the only sound she made, her presence already fading into the hostile landscape, just another shadow they had chosen to ignore. The air inside the command tent was thick with the smell of stale coffee and overworked electronics. Maps covered a central table held down by ammunition cans. Colonel Marcus Thorne stood over them, a man in his early 40s with a crisp haircut and an air of coiled, impatient energy. He looked up as Alara entered, his eyes flicking over her with a dismissive glance that took in her age, her civilian attire, and her slight limp. It was the look of a man who believed experience was measured only in recent deployments, not in the quiet accumulation of years. "Vance?" he asked, his tone clipped. "You're late. The weather window is closing." "The pilot was thorough, Colonel," Alara replied, her voice calm and even. She placed her duffel bag neatly by the tent flap. He preferred a safe landing to a punctual one. Thorne grunted, a sound that conveyed his opinion of such caution. He gestured vaguely at a small, rickety table in the corner, piled high with printouts and binders. "That's your station. All the manifests and requisitions are there. I need your audit completed by 0800 Friday. A transport chopper is scheduled to fly out then, weather permitting. I want your report on it." He turned back to his maps, his body language a clear dismissal. The conversation, as far as he was concerned, was over. Alara didn't move to the corner. Instead, she walked slowly toward the central table, her gaze tracing the topographical lines and the red markers indicating suspected enemy positions. Your forward listening post, OP Juliet, is exposed, Colonel. The seasonal winds shift in this valley. By nightfall, the acoustics will carry sound from the east, not the west. They won't hear an approach from the Zabar Pass. Thorne stiffened. He turned his head slowly, his expression a mixture of irritation and disbelief. I beg your pardon. The Zabar Pass, Alara repeated, pointing a slender finger at a contour line on the map. The goat path is narrow, but a small, disciplined force could traverse it in under 3 hours, especially with this cloud cover. The prevailing winds will mask their sound signature. Your thermal sensors will be less effective with the drop in ambient temperature. You're blind on that flank. A tense silence fell over the tent. Thorne's XO, a young captain named Ives, shifted his weight uncomfortably. He stared at Alara as if she'd just started speaking in tongues. Thorne's lips thinned into a hard line. Ms. Vance, your job is to count bullets and blankets. My job is to deploy them. I have been in this region for 18 months. My intelligence teams have assessed the threats. That pass is considered impassable in these conditions. Now, if you don't mind, stick to your spreadsheets. The condescension dripped from every word. He saw her as an armchair general, a civilian meddler who'd read a manual once and thought she understood the complexities of his battlefield. The people who live in these mountains don't read the same manuals, Colonel, she said softly, her gaze unwavering. Is that so? Thorne straightened to his full height, using his physical presence as a tool of intimidation. Let me be perfectly clear. You are a guest here, a temporary and frankly inconvenient one. You will perform the duties you were assigned, you will not question my command decisions, and you will stay out of the way of the men and women who are actually fighting this war. Am I understood? Perfectly, Colonel, Alara said. She gave the map one last, lingering look before turning away. She walked to the corner he had designated for her, the cramped space a physical representation of the box he had put her in. She sat down, pulled a neatly organized binder from her duffel, and opened it. To Thorne, her obedience was a victory, a reaffirmation of his authority. He turned back to his map, dismissing the old woman and her strange, unsolicited warnings. He didn't see the look in her eyes. It wasn't defiance or anger. It was a profound and weary sadness. The look of someone who had seen this exact brand of arrogant certainty before and knew, with chilling clarity, how it would end. She began her work, the soft rustle of her papers a quiet counterpoint to the growing howl of the wind outside, a storm she had predicted and another he refused to see. The storm hit with the ferocity of a biblical plague. It did not arrive. It materialized, a sudden, suffocating wall of white that swallowed the mountains, the base, and the sky itself. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at the tent fabric and driving snow into every conceivable crevice. Visibility dropped to 0. The world shrank to the immediate, vibrating space around you. Within an hour, FOB Nightingale was an isolated island in a sea of frozen chaos. Colonel Thorne had dismissed the storm's severity, just as he had dismissed Alara's warning about the pass. His meteorologists had predicted a moderate squall, not this monster. Now he was trapped, blind, and cut off. The satellite link, their only connection to the outside world, became a sputtering mess of static before dying completely. The FOB was alone. The first explosion was a dull, heavy thump that was felt more than heard, a concussion that traveled through the frozen ground. It came from the west perimeter, from the exact sector Alara had identified as vulnerable. Sergeant Reyes's squad, on watch in a hastily dug-in position, screamed over the radio. Their words were a panicked jumble of contacts, RPGs, and heavy machine gun fire. Then silence. A second explosion, much closer, rocked the command tent. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into a red-tinted darkness from the emergency strobes. A mortar round had impacted near the generator farm. Sparks showered into the blizzard, and the hum of the base's power grid faded into the howl of the wind. Get the backup generator online, Thorn roared, his voice tight with adrenaline. Comms? I want a sit rep from all sectors. Now! But there was no one to answer. The primary comm station was a tangle of sparking wires and shattered screens, shrapnel from the mortar strike having torn through the tent wall. The young communications specialist lay on the floor, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Captain Ives, his face pale, rushed to the soldier's side, but it was too late. Panic began to curdle the air. It was a coordinated attack, brutally effective, using the storm as the ultimate weapon. The enemy was inside the wire. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions at once, the sharp crack of AK-47s mixing with the deeper, more methodical reports of the defenders' M4S. It was impossible to tell where the main thrust was. The attackers were ghosts in the blizzard, their muzzle flashes brief, disorienting strobes in the swirling snow. Thorn, for all his textbook knowledge, was paralyzed by the chaos. His command structure had been decapitated in seconds. His eyes, the base's electronic sensors, were blind. His voice, the radio net, was silent. He grabbed a rifle, his face a mask of grim fury. "Rally on me. We push to the west wall," he yelled, reverting to the base instincts of a lieutenant, not the strategic mind of a colonel. He was trying to plug a single leak in a dam that was collapsing everywhere at once. Outside, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Reyes and the two survivors from his squad were pinned down behind a stack of HESCO barriers, a heavy machine gun chewing up their cover. They were cut off from the main barracks, their ammunition running low. Davies, part of a different fire team, found his position being systematically flanked. The enemy wasn't just attacking. They were hunting, moving with a chilling familiarity of the base's layout. They knew the weak points, the blind spots, the patrol routes. It was the work of careful, patient intelligence. In the flickering red gloom of the ruined command tent, amid the shouting and the fear, Alara Vance moved with an unnatural calm. She had spent the first few moments of the attack on the floor, just like everyone else. But now she was up. She wasn't looking for a weapon. She wasn't shouting orders. She was observing, processing, analyzing. While Thorn saw chaos, she saw a pattern. The mortar strike on the generator and comms wasn't random. It was a classic decapitation strike. The multi-directional attacks weren't a full frontal assault. They were designed to sow confusion and fix the defenders in place. The enemy wasn't trying to overrun the base. They were hurting them. They were driving the defenders away from something. But what? Her eyes scanned the wreckage, her mind a cold, clear engine of logic in the heart of the storm. The faltering had begun. The system was broken. And into that vacuum, a different kind of order was about to emerge. While Thorn tried to rally a fire team for a desperate charge, Alara moved to the wrecked communications hub. Shrapnel had shredded the main console, and the air smelled of burnt plastic and ozone. Captain Ives, his hands shaking, was fumbling with a field radio, trying to raise anyone, his calls swallowed by static. "That won't work," Alara said, her voice cutting through his panicked attempts. "The primary antenna array is gone. The repeaters are unpowered." I've stared at her, his eyes wide with shock. "We're cut off. We're completely cut off." "Not completely," she replied. She knelt, her movements precise, and began pulling at the tangled mess of wires behind the main server rack. Her fingers, nimble despite her age, found a thick, shielded coaxial cable. The old seismic sensor network is hard-lined and runs on its own independent power source. Obsolete, but the copper is still good. She produced a small toolkit from a pouch on her belt, something no one had noticed she carried. In it were a wire stripper, a crimper, and several connectors. Thorn, who had paused his charge to see what was happening, watched in stunned silence. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Vance? This is no time to play mechanic." Alara didn't look up. "The enemy cut your voice, Colonel. I'm giving you a new 1-inch." Her hands moved with a surgeon's precision. She stripped the coaxial cable, then spliced it into the power supply of a surviving short-range radio handset. She bypassed the fried amplifiers, creating a crude but functional closed-circuit system, a hardline intercom connecting the few command stations that hadn't been obliterated. It was a messy, ugly fix, a bastardization of 3 different generations of technology. But in less than 2 minutes, a speaker on the far side of the tent crackled to life. "This is Vance," she said into the handset. "Report." The voice of a terrified private came back. "Ma'am? Who is this? We're taking heavy fire at the south gate. They're trying to breach the wire." "Negative, Private," Alara said, her tone utterly level. "They are not trying to breach. They are fixing you in place. Report fire direction and volume." The private, shocked into action by her authority, gave the report. As another call came in from the northern perimeter, Alara began to sketch a map on a clear patch of the table with a grease pencil. She wasn't just marking enemy positions. She was drawing vectors, lines of attack that all converged on a single, seemingly unimportant section of the base. The logistics depot. The supply yard. "They're not trying to take the base," she said, looking at Thorn. "They're conducting a raid. They want your supplies. Fuel, ammunition, medical kits. Everything they need to survive the winter and continue their fight." Thorn stared at the map. She was right. The probing attacks were a feint, a complex and deadly distraction. The real objective was the poorly defended supply yard. "Reyes," she said into the makeshift intercom, her voice now reaching the few handsets she had managed to link. "Sergeant Reyes, what is your status?" The reply was weak, laced with the crackle of nearby gunfire. "Pinned down. West wall. 3 of us left. Low on ammo. Look to your left, Sergeant. 20 meters. Do you see a drainage culvert? Covered by a steel grate." There was a pause. "Jesus, yeah, I see it. It's ancient." "It's not a culvert," Alara said. "It's an access tunnel for old generator conduits. It runs underneath the main yard and emerges behind the B-Rations warehouse, Section Gamma. You will enter that tunnel. You will be exposed for 5 seconds crossing the open ground to get to it. Go on my mark. I will provide suppression." "Suppression?" Reyes coughed. "With what? We're the only ones over here." Alara looked at a young private cowering near the tent flap. "You. What's your name?" "Harris, ma'am." "Harris? Can you operate a mortar?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good," she pointed to the map. "There are 2 81mm tubes in the secondary arms locker. The enemy machine gun suppressing Reyes is located at these coordinates. You will put 3 rounds of high explosive on that position. You will not bracket. You will fire for effect on the first volley. Can you do that?" The private stared, then a flicker of resolve entered his eyes. He nodded. "Go," she commanded. She turned back to the handset. "Reyes, get ready. Harris is your suppression. On my mark 3, 2, 1. Mark." Seconds later, the deep thump-thump-thump of the mortar firing echoed across the base, followed by a series of shattering explosions from the west. "Go, Reyes. Go now," she yelled into the radio. Alara's actions cascaded through the failing defense. She wasn't just issuing orders. She was rewiring the entire nervous system of the FOB. She directed a medical team to a fortified storage locker, a place far safer than the exposed aid station. She had a non-essential water pump reversed, flooding a low-lying area and creating a muddy trap for advancing enemy fighters. She instructed the mess sergeant to use bags of flour and sugar from the pantry as makeshift sandbags to reinforce a crumbling wall, their dense mass almost as effective as sand. Each command was logical, precise, and drew upon a knowledge of the base's infrastructure that no one, least of all Colonel Thorn, knew she possessed. She was playing the entire base like an instrument, and under her direction, the discordant noise of chaos was slowly, improbably, beginning to sound like a symphony of defiance. Thorn stood by, his own rifle hanging uselessly in his hands, watching a logistics auditor save his command. Colonel Thorn watched, his authority evaporating in the cold, red-lit air. The woman he had dismissed as a paper pusher was conducting a defense of his base with a coherence he could not muster. Her voice on the makeshift comms net was a lifeline of pure logic in a sea of fear. It wasn't loud or commanding, but it was absolute. Soldiers, accustomed to shouted orders and frantic commands, responded to its quiet certainty. He stumbled over to the salvaged comm station where a junior officer, a lieutenant named Chen, was desperately trying to get a signal out on a long-range tactical radio powered by a vehicle battery. Chen had an antenna strung precariously to the tent's damaged frame, pointing it skyward like a prayer. "Anything?" Thorne demanded. "Just static, sir. The storm's ionospheric interference is—" Chen stopped, his eyes widening. A voice, heavily distorted but intelligible, cut through the hiss. It was faint, skipping across mountaintops from a command post hundreds of miles away. "Nightingale, repeat, this is Task Force Command. Do you copy? What is your status?" "Nightingale?" Chun grabbed the microphone, his hand trembling. "Task Force Command, this is FOB Nightingale. We are under attack. Our comms are down. Command structure compromised. We have multiple casualties. We need immediate support." The voice on the other end was garbled for a moment. Then it sharpened with urgency. "Nightingale, we read you, faint but clear. Support is impossible until the storm breaks. You are on your own. Listen carefully. We have an asset on site. Is she secure? I repeat, is asset secure?" Thorne and Chun exchanged a confused look. "Asset, sir? We have no special assets here." The voice came back, insistent and strained. "Check your roster. A civilian contractor, Vance, Alara Vance. We need confirmation. We need to speak with Artemis." The name hung in the air, alien and powerful. Artemis. Thorne's blood ran cold. It wasn't a name, it was a legend. A call sign from the old wars, the quiet conflicts fought in shadows and whispered about in intelligence briefings. Artemis was a ghost, a master strategist credited with orchestrating a dozen impossible victories before vanishing from the official records 20 years ago. The files were sealed, the identity a state secret known only to a handful of people at the highest levels of command. She was a myth. Thorne turned his head slowly, his gaze falling upon the gray-haired woman leaning over the map. She was pointing out a new vector of attack to a squad leader, her expression one of intense, unbroken focus. The quiet auditor, the meddling old woman, Artemis. The pieces slammed together in his mind with the force of a physical impact. Her encyclopedic knowledge of tactics, her uncanny understanding of the terrain, her unnerving calm, the limp. He remembered a single, heavily redacted line in the Artemis file he'd read years ago as a young intelligence officer. "Wounded in action, Tirana Valley campaign." The voice from the radio crackled again, now frantic. "Colonel, do you understand? Find her. We need Artemis." Thorne felt a profound sense of vertigo, as if the frozen ground beneath him had given way. He had stood on the shoulders of a giant and had done nothing but complain about the view. He took the handset from Chen, his own voice hoarse, unrecognizable. "Task Force Command," he said, the words catching in his throat. "Artemis is currently engaged." He let the handset drop. He looked at Alara, who had just finished directing Reyes's squad, now armed and repositioned, to ambush the enemy's main force as it entered the kill zone she had created in the supply depot. She glanced up, her eyes meeting his for a brief second. There was no triumph in them, no hint of "I told you so." There was only the quiet, relentless focus of the task at hand. The high-ranking officer on the other end of the radio, a 3-star General Thorne knew by reputation, seemed to understand. His voice, when it came back, was stripped of all protocol, filled only with a desperate hope. "Colonel, tell General Vance, that the board is set. Her move, General." The word struck Thorne with more force than the mortar blast. He looked at the unassuming woman in the borrowed parka. General Alara Vance. Retired, or so everyone had thought. He finally understood. She wasn't just a logistics auditor. She was the final, unbreakable line of defense. And he had told her to stick to her spreadsheets. The battle for FOB Nightingale turned not on a heroic charge or a massive show of force, but on a series of quiet, brutally efficient tactical decisions. Guided by Alara's voice, the scattered defenders coalesced into a cohesive fighting unit. Reyes's three-man team, emerging from the utility tunnel behind the main enemy element, became a scalpel. They didn't engage in a prolonged firefight. They eliminated the enemy's command element and their heavy machine gun with a few precise, coordinated bursts before melting back into the shadows of the supply yard. The flooded ground near the south gate became a death trap. The attackers, bogged down in the freezing mud, were easy targets for the defenders firing from reinforced positions. The flour bag wall held. The entire rhythm of the fight had shifted. The defenders, once hunted, were now the hunters. Alara's strategy had turned the enemy's greatest strength, their knowledge of the base's weaknesses, against them. She used their predictable pathing to lead them into one interlocking field of fire after another. By the time the first hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, the attack had broken. The surviving raiders fled back into the blizzard, dragging their wounded, leaving behind a trail of blood on the fresh snow. The gunfire sputtered out, replaced by an exhausted, ringing silence, punctuated only by the mournful cry of the wind. The aftermath was a scene of controlled devastation. The base was scarred, littered with the detritus of battle, but it had not fallen. The soldiers moved like ghosts through the swirling snow, their faces blackened with cordite and streaked with grime. They were exhausted, some wounded, but they were alive, and they all moved with a new awareness. Their eyes followed Alara Vance. As she moved from the command tent to the makeshift triage center, a path cleared for her. No one spoke to her, but the silence was heavier than any words. It was filled with a dawning, reverential awe. They no longer saw a frail, elderly bureaucrat. They saw the architect of their survival. They watched her kneel beside a wounded soldier, applying a pressure dressing with the same calm efficiency she had used to rewire the comms panel, her voice low and reassuring. Sergeant Reyes found her there. His face was a mask of exhaustion, his uniform torn. He had seen 6 of his men die, and he had nearly been the 7th. He walked up to her, his movements stiff. He didn't speak. He simply unclipped the insulated canteen from his belt, his last one, filled with water he had been carefully rationing, and held it out to her. It was a soldier's offering, a gesture of profound, unspoken respect. Alara looked up, met his gaze, and accepted it with a small nod. She took a short sip and handed it back. A debt had been acknowledged and repaid in that simple, silent exchange. Later, as a weary sun tried to burn through the thinning clouds, Colonel Thorne found her standing near the western perimeter, looking out at the Zabar Pass. His left arm was in a sling, his face pale beneath a layer of grime, but he stood ramrod straight. The arrogance had been stripped from him, burned away by the fires of the last few hours, leaving behind something humbled and raw. He stopped a few feet away from her, waiting to be acknowledged. Alara turned her head slightly, her gray eyes meeting his. Thorne took a breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. He brought his right hand up in a slow, deliberate salute. It was not the crisp, perfunctory gesture he gave his subordinates. It was the formal, deeply respectful salute reserved for a superior officer of the highest rank. A salute he had not rendered in over a decade. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quiet but clear over the wind. The word was freighted with everything he couldn't say. His apology, his gratitude, his awe. He held the salute, his eyes locked on hers. "General." Alara held his gaze for a long moment. She didn't return the salute. She was officially a civilian. Instead, she gave him the slightest of nods. It was enough. It was everything. It was acceptance. The dismissal was over. The respect, earned in blood and strategy, had finally, irrevocably, arrived. The storm broke with the dawn. Light spilled over the jagged peaks, painting the vast expanse of snow in hues of pale gold and rose. The wind died down to a whisper, and a profound, crystalline silence settled over the mountains. The world felt new, washed clean. FOB Nightingale, however, bore the scars of the night's violence. Black smudges marred the white snow. The The perimeter fence was torn open in several places like a burst seam. The silence was the silence of exhaustion, of grief, of survival. Elara Vance stood alone on a makeshift rampart of Hesco barriers, the one she had directed to be reinforced with supply crates. She wasn't looking at the damage to the base. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, on the distant, formidable line of mountains that separated this place from the rest of the world. Her parka was zipped to her chin, her hands tucked into her pockets for warmth. She looked small against the immense, indifferent landscape. Behind her, the life of the base was beginning to stir again. The sounds were muted, respectful. The clink of metal as soldiers cleared jammed weapons. The low murmur of voices as casualties were counted and the dead were prepared for their final journey. There was no celebration, only the grim, necessary work that follows a battle. Corporal Davies, the young soldier who had smirked at her upon her arrival, approached her cautiously. His face was smudged, and a crude bandage was wrapped around his forearm. He held a steaming metal mug in his good hand. He walked up to the barrier beside her but didn't speak. He simply placed the mug on top of a wooden crate near her elbow and then, after a moment's hesitation, stepped back and walked away without a word. Elara heard the soft clink of the mug. She turned her head, saw the steam rising from it in the frigid air. It was coffee, black and strong. She wrapped her cold fingers around the warm metal, the heat a small, welcome anchor in the vastness of the morning. She took a slow sip. It was bitter, just the way she liked it. She had done what was necessary. The past she had tried to leave behind had found her, as it always did. The name Artemis and the rank of general now hung in the air of the FOB, spoken in hushed, reverent tones. But for Elara, they were just labels for a life she no longer lived. They described the strategist, the commander. They did not define the woman who now stood watching the sun rise, cataloging the necessary repairs in her mind. The ammo dump still needed to be relocated. The western perimeter's blind spot needed a permanent sensor tower. The inventory of medical supplies would have to be completely redone. Colonel Thorne was coordinating the repair crews now, his voice devoid of its earlier arrogance, replaced by a quiet, focused competence. He was a good officer who had learned a hard lesson. He would be better for it. The soldiers, Reyes and Davies and the others, moved with a new gravity, the swagger of youth tempered by the heavy knowledge of their own fragility. They had survived, and they knew whom to thank. Their respect was a quiet, heavy blanket that now covered her. But Elara wasn't looking for their respect. She had only ever sought to do the work that needed doing. She took another sip of the coffee, the warmth spreading through her. The battle was over, but the logistics remained. An audit still needed to be completed. A report had to be filed. The quiet, thankless, essential work continued. The sun climbed higher, and its light touched her face, revealing the fine lines of a long and difficult life, and the unyielding calm in the eyes of a woman who had, once again, simply counted what was lost, tallied what remained, and prepared for the next day.